Okay, let us begin. I'm going to go ahead and start by desoldering these capacitors. Now, before I get too much into that, you're probably wondering what the best way is to deal with these tiny little components that you find here on these boards. And one of the best ways I know of is hot air. However, that is usually outside the realm of the average hobbyist. So I will go ahead and show removing some of these components with hot air, but I'm probably going to be doing most of this work with a soldering iron because that's what most of you will have to deal with. And anyway, let's dig in and get started. Okay, now a few other notes on soldering that I want to mention with this is what temperature should you use when desoldering components from a board like this. And there isn't really a hard firm answer to that. You'll get a lot of different opinions that people have on the matter, but really one of the simplest things is you want to use a temperature that's hot enough that it melts the solder, but not so hot that you risk damaging some of the components. Most of these chips are going to be a little bit more sensitive to heat, and so you don't want to just sit there and just keep heating and heating and heating. And interestingly enough, while you want to be hot enough to melt the solder, you also don't want to be so hot that you'll damage those components. But if your temperature is too low, like just barely hot enough that it melts the solder, you can sometimes actually increase the risk of damaging those components because you have to keep the heat on so long. And one thing I found with a few of these Apple boards that I've dealt with in the past is right around 420 Celsius seems to be a pretty good point for me. And anyway, I am about ready to get started. I need to get my hot air going, and I'm going to show you that first. Okay, so I'm going to start here with about 400 degrees centigrade. I think that will make for a decent starting point, and let's just go in and start preheating around this capacitor. We just want to gently blow on it, get everything kind of heated up, and then another thing about these particular capacitors that I found on some of these boards that I've worked on in the past is they actually have a little bit of glue on the underside. And that makes them just a little harder to remove. But anyway, that guy came off pretty easy there. And we'll just repeat the process with the rest of these. See, that one's not quite ready to come. But I just heat the area, and you can see the solder starting to melt. And there it goes. Yeah, the hot air really makes short work of these capacitors. Anyway, I need to, now because those two values aren't the same, I'm going to work slow here and make sure that I don't get anything mixed up. So I am going to solder the new components on before I continue too much further here. The new capacitors I'm using, here I've got a pack of them still sealed. These are tantalum capacitors, and they have a dark line on them as well. However, they are completely the opposite. The dark line on these indicates the positive side. That's not something I am used to, and that is something I learned the hard way, so I'm going to make sure to emphasize this here, that the dark line on these new ones is positive. And if you put them in backwards, they will not work correctly. And you know, in a best case scenario, they may not work like they're supposed to. Worst case scenario, they will explode, and it is possible that they could also damage other components. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead. This particular one that goes in this corner of the board is a 1 picofarad, 50 volt rated, and it's the only one on the board like this. Now, you'll probably typically do this with solder, but I personally just plop it right where it goes. I'll show you here. If I touch my soldering iron to this, you can see that paste immediately starts to melt. And at first the flux just flows, but then after a second you'll see the solder flow out, and I want to position this exactly where it goes. And there we go. That one is attached on that side. Then I just repeat for the other side. Solder flows, and that is secured in place. While I'm here, I'm just going to quick touch up the legs on. Alright, now for these, well, let's do this 100 picofarad capacitor on its own, because it's kind of a unique animal. see there's 5 more on this board. There was one that I didn't see, so there's actually 2 over here. So there's 3 on the other side of the memory module, and I only saw 2 of them. So with the soldering iron, because that's what most of you are going to have to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So when I do this with a soldering iron, first thing I'm going to want to do is actually add solder. Again, that may seem counterintuitive to some, that, oh, you know, you're trying to remove a part, and so you should add more solder. But sometimes that solder just helps you get that heat transfer that you need. So there, I can kind of heat that part up, and if I gently just don't want to damage those solder pads. Yeah, these caps don't make it easy. Just gently heat it up. Feel that solder melt. Just gently wiggle that just a little bit. When it's melted, it'll start to let go. You need to alternate back and forth because you just have to. But you can see the hot air makes this so much easier, and you can see why most professionals use hot air for desoldering parts. It makes life much easier and really reduces your risk of damaging stuff. That is just stubborn. A little more solder on this side, I think. Good grief. I don't want to risk ruining the pads. There we go. Got it off and did not ruin the pad. Okay, I'm just going to show you just that one, because that is not... If you have a choice, use hot air. If you don't have a choice, just be slow and careful, be patient, and make sure you can get enough heat into that joint. And there's right off a hard drive. Alright, well, I have